Were you in UIL?
Well, I worked in the Denton chapter for several years. Started in about 1972, and I was in the Denton chapter in the beginning, and then moved to the Dallas chapter in the late 70s, early 80s, and then worked a high school in the Dallas chapter, and then transitioned. I was in the Lone Star Conference for a couple of years, and then got in the Southwest Conference in 1988. And I worked 6 years in the Southwest Conference, and then my real life took me to Kentucky, so I transitioned over to the Southeastern Conference and worked there for about 10 years.
What positions did you work both in high school and college?
Well, mostly referee. When I went into the Southwest Conference, I went in as a field judge because they didn't ever take anybody in as a referee in those days. And I worked 3 years as a field judge and then worked 3 years as a referee. Then when I went to the SEC, I was a referee all the time. In high school, I started out, everybody starts out working, different positions and moving around. And I began to do some refereeing in junior high and high school games probably after 4 or 5 years in. And by the time I got into the Southwest Conference, I'd really been nothing but a referee for about 10 years in high school.
How long have you been the coordinator of officials for the NCAA?
When I went to be the coordinator of officials for the Southeastern Conference in 2006 and did that for 5 years. And then in 2011, I became the national coordinator. So I've been in it now, 9 years, I guess, coming up on 9 years.
Of course, we know Texas has the best high school football officials in the nation. Now it's the last state playing by NCAA rules. That's obviously got to help with when colleges are looking for officials, that they can get guys right out of Texas and already know most of the rules minus the exceptions.
They don't need to unlearn the federation rules and learn the I don't know federation rules. I worked in high school in Texas and then worked at college, so I've never had to learn the federation rules. But yeah, I mean, first of all, high school football in Texas is the best ever. I mean, it's the best high school football in the world. I've lived in Colorado, I've lived in Kentucky, live in Alabama now, and I can tell you that there's nothing quite like Texas high school football. And so the officials, I mean, the level of the officiating has to be up very high because the level of the football itself is very high. And as you say, the fact that NCAA rules are worked in Texas high schools, that means that the high school officials in Texas are better equipped already to go to the NCAA and work college ball. So it's a huge advantage.
There's a couple major rule changes and updates here in Texas. One is the UIL got rid of the exception for the 10-second runoff, so now that's going to be coming in. I was at a game last year where that would have changed the outcome of the game. How do you see the 10-second runoff affecting the game besides just potentially changing outcomes of the game?
It's a big change that when the colleges made it a few years ago, it was a sizable change. It doesn't come into play as much as you might think because it is a very it's only except for the helmet rule and the injury. But in terms of the 10-second runoff itself, inside the minute of the half, it doesn't come into play all that much. But when it does, it's an important rule because it allows the team that's other than the offended team, so to speak, has the option. They can decline the runoff or not, and that controls when the clock starts because. If you have the 10-second runoff, the 10-second runoff rule overrides any other clock rule. So in a situation where you might have started the clock on the snap, let's say, if they accept the 10-second runoff, then you're going to start on the ready for play no matter what else is going on. So that's an important difference of the 10-second runoff rule. It's hard to know how much impact that's going to have on high school football in Texas, but it certainly is an important rule for the game itself.
Do you think it's going to be harder for the on-field officials to remember it, or is it going to be harder for the clock operators to know it?
The clock operators, the clock operators need to understand that the officials on the field are in charge of that. So the clock operators should not make a decision about this independent of what the referee tells them. It's going to be up to the officials to learn the rule. There's no question about that. And it's not a hard rule to learn, but there's some steps that you have to go through in understanding it. But the clock operators need to just need to follow whatever the crew on the field tells them and not make an independent decision on their own.
There's some changes to the targeting rule. I've got to be honest, I haven't looked at them all yet, but I know the big thing with targeting in college is you at least get the opportunity to replay to make sure it is targeting. In high school, we only have it at the state finals level. How do you see that potentially being maybe even a problem because officials don't have that luxury of replay?
Well, I mean, the fact that every targeting foul in college is reviewed, and so there's not any, well, some are and some aren't. There's no decision to be made. If you have a targeting foul, it's going to be reviewed. Now, in high school, of course, where they don't have the replay review, then they have, my understanding is that in high schools in Texas, they're doing a targeting 1, targeting 2, depending on the severity of the hit. And that's a little bit more difficult because it's hard, in my view, it's hard to make the distinction between 1 and 2, and it's quite likely that everything will devolve to the lesser of the two evils. So we'll see how it goes. But I think when they do use replay in the championship game, then they'll presumably use the college rules in that case.
How would you, if you were the head of the UIL or the rules of the officials here in Texas, how would you advise the officials to call targeting because they don't have the luxury of replay to be able to bail them out if they're incorrect? Well,
the targeting rule itself is very clear in the book, and so it's, you got to have all the elements of targeting. You got to have an indicator. If it's a defenseless player, you got to have forcible contact to the head and neck area. If it's a crown or helmet foul, you got to have crown. And in every case, it's got to be attack with forcible contact. Those are the two elements that are the most. The notion of a player being in attack mode and making forcible contact. Those are the two things. And that part of the rule is going to be the same regardless of whether it's college or high school. But what the high school officials in Texas are going to have to make a decision about, is it targeting 1, targeting 2, and they'll just have to sort out what those differences are.
Texas, we play our state championship games at Cowboy Stadium. A lot of our semifinals and quarterfinals are played in college and pro stadiums across the state. Do you think the UIL should expand the replay out to some of those quarterfinals and semifinals because we know replay has almost become as important to the game as the whistle?
Well, of course, that's a determination they need to make. But I mean, it does put a burden on the crew and on the replay officials if you're only working at one game a year, and the most important game of the year. So it would make sense from a logical standpoint to sort of move that down to the other games and lower level games. But to some extent that's going to be an economic decision. I'm sure that's what's driving whether or not they use it in these games. But certainly from a standpoint of the importance of the rule and the importance of the foul, it needs to be there. Now, having said all that, even now in college ball, it only happens once every 4 or 5 games. So it's not like it was a rule that was invoked all the time and all that. So, and I don't know what Texas high school experience has been with it, but in colleges, I mean, it's a serious foul, it's a serious penalty. The thing that makes it serious is the fact that you're kicking a player out of the game. But nevertheless, it only happens fairly infrequently, and it's getting better all the time. We see player behavior changing in college ball, no question about that.
Let me ask you this. I know the NFL has now added some penalties that are now reviewable after the whole Rams-Saints fiasco. Do you see the NCAA potentially expanding replay into more of the judgment calls, or do you see the NCAA not going to have the NFL and just trying to stay out of it as much as they can?
I think the NCAA is going to stay away from it, and I'm advising the Rules Committee to do that. And the Rules Committee had some conversation about that this year because of the situation in the playoff game with the Saints. And there was not any appetite at all for going down that road. So I think that's a good decision. I think it's as a matter of principle, it's bad policy to make a rule change on the basis of a single play. And I would never advise a committee to do that. And so the Rules Committee is sort of taking let's stay away from this for a while and look at it from 30,000 feet and see what we want to do in terms of making these judgment calls reviewable. But I'm advising that they not do that.
Briefly, any other major rule changes coming this fall, maybe like 30 seconds or so, anything? I know blindside blocking, they're updating.
The blindside block rule is the new one, because now if you have a foul that last year would have been targeting, if the contact on a defensive player is in the head or neck area, if that contact is lower, same kind of contact but lower, then you would have a foul for a blindside block. So the language is the same. It's if you attack with forcible contact from the blind side, then that's a foul. And if it's in the head and neck area, then it's blindside block with targeting. And if they take the targeting off, you still have the 15-yard penalty for the blindside block.